Welcome everybody to our series Frontiers in Migration Research. The idea of this seminar series, for those who have not attended yet, is bringing together scholars from different disciplines who work on migration and integration from a quantitative perspective. So we have scholars from sociology, political sciences, economics, psychology, medical sciences, geography, and demography who participate in this seminar series. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Massey. Dr. Massey, I guess everybody here in the audience knows him. He is professor in Princeton, at the same time adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and also teach before at the University of Berkeley. He is the current president of the American Academy of Political Science and Social Sciences, and was former president of the American Sociological Association. It's very difficult. He has an extremely rich research record to bring it in to characterize that in a couple of words. I think there are 3 or 4 main areas of his research. One is on the causes and deeper roots of international migration, irregular border crossings, and also the violence associated with that. I see in this research also many similarities to refugee migration we do see currently in Europe. Then the other research area is around ethnicity, co-ethnic concentration networks, residential segregation, social stratification, which is linked to this nexus. And he's also an expert on Latin American societies and in particular on Mexico. And as somebody who is working on migrant surveys, we also admire his work on the Mexican Migration Project or the New Immigrant Survey in the United States. Yes, he has an impressive publication record ranging from Science, American Journal of Sociology, and all other famous journals, and is also author of about 18 or 20 books, to mention just a couple of them: American Apartheid, Brokered Boundaries, World in Motion. That are at least those ones I have read, but there are many, many others. Yes, and I guess in one way or another, everybody in this audience is familiar with his research, and we are looking forward today to his talk on the shape of things to come, global migration after 2020. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing.
Yes, it works.
Okay. So I'm going to talk, give a little bit more of a broader talk than I usually give right now. I'm going to talk about the big picture of things in a long historical sweep. So we know that humans are a migratory species. We emerged in East Africa about 300,000 years ago and then began moving. You can see the pathway of human migration out of East Africa into Europe and Asia, across to Australia about 50,000 years ago, crossing the Bering Sea land bridge into the Americas about 12,000 years ago. Reaching the southern tip of of South America about 12,000 years ago. So we're a moving people that move a lot. Let's see if I can get rid of this. I want to talk first about the first era of globalization from 1500 to 1914. And this was an era of globalization under mercantilism and industrialism. and particularly European mercantilism between 1500 and 1800. European colonization, Europe moved out after creating the system of nation states in Europe, moved out and colonized a great part of the rest of the world, setting up a number of extractive economies, particularly plantation economies in the Americas and parts of South Asia, which the ones in the Americas ran on slave labor, and it fueled a slave trade that brought about 12 million Africans into the New World over a period of about 300 years. So European mercantilism lasted from 1500 to 1800, and then industrialization begins around 1800, and starts in Britain, sweeps to the continent, and spreads through the continent and jumps across to overseas extension of former European colonies that were settler societies in the Americas and Oceania. So industrialization displaces rural populations, leading to internal labor migration that drives the urbanization of Europe. But cities were never strong enough or receptive enough economically to accept all the people being displaced from the countryside. So international migration drives urbanization of European settler nations, as massive numbers of people move out of Europe into the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and a few select other destinations. And this spurred a great accumulation of capital, with domestic investment accelerating European industrialization and foreign investment spurring industrialization of the new settler nations, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, and Argentina. So here you see the industrial era migration stream with the major population movements from 1500 to 1914. The major population movements before industrialization were the slave trade, about 12 million people out of Africa into the Americas for the most part, and some from Africa into the Middle East. But the biggest flows were the 32 million people out of Europe into North America, the 7.4 million into South America, some movement within the Russian Empire, movement out of China, and the first era of globalization under industrialization had several notable characteristics. It allowed for the free cross-border movement of all factors of production: financial capital, capital goods, commodities, finished goods, and labor, primarily workers, but also some skilled workers that played an important role in the migratory processes. So you had free movement of people as well as financial capital goods and commodities. And the end of the first era of globalization really occurs because of internal weaknesses within the system of globalization that was set up. The underlying infrastructure of the global market was fragmented and weak, problematic currency exchanges, severe liquidity constraints across overseas, no global architecture for investment, no real rules of trade, no multilateral institutions to resolve conflicts short of warfare. And the industrializing nations were politically divided. Within Europe, aristocrats versus industrialists throughout the developed world, labor versus capital, rural versus urban, native versus immigrant. And the system collapse really begins with the onset of World War I in 1914. And following the conclusion of the bloody war, nations turned inward, erecting tariff barriers in the 1920s, capital controls in the 1920s, restrictive immigration policies in the 1920s, and attempting to shift towards economic autarky or complete independence. And this led to a bleak interregnum between 1918 and 1945, with a fragmentation of the old political order. Aristocracies were overthrown or contained. Multinational empires became heterogeneous nation states, and we had a stillborn League of Nations. And everything came crashing down in 1929 with the onset of the global economic depression, which exacerbated ethnic and racial tensions in places like the United States and led to an international ideological struggle between liberal democracy, fascism, and communism. And the the struggle was eventually resolved through a Second World War, which brought about the economic degradation of Europe and Japan and the entry into a new Cold War standoff between the Soviet Union and the West, led by the United States. But in 1945 and 46, the foundations for the second era of globalization were laid down at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in the United States, which founded the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Short time later in San Francisco, the United Nations was chartered. So these institutions set the stage for a second phase of globalization, but the post-industrial globalization was slow to get started. The roots of reglobalization occur from 1945 to 1979 with the progressive decolonization of European colonies throughout the world. And the Bretton institutions begin to do their work. The IMF ensures convertibility of currencies and liquidity. World Bank finances the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, and then finances development in the newly decolonized societies. And the United Nations manages to avoid another global warfare, if not war, more generally. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade gradually lowers tariff barriers. The Annecy Round, the Torquay Round, the Geneva Round, the Dillon Round, the Kennedy Round, and the Tokyo Round progressively lower trade barriers through trading countries in the new emerging global system. And the barriers to immigration began to be lowered in the 1950s and 1960s, with guest worker programs enacted in the 1950s and 1960s, immigration reform in the traditional settler societies of the United States, Canada, and Australia. And you begin to see post-colonial migrations out of former colonies into the colonizing powers of Europe. And the US dollar is decoupled from the gold standard in 1971 to create a freely floating fiat currencies backed by governments that gives us the current system of exchange today. We also have pronounced structural shifts from beginning in the 1970s to 2020, as we shift from analog to digital communication and computation, shift from manufacturing to a knowledge-based service economy. China turns toward the market under Deng Xiaoping in 1979, and the Soviet Union dissolves between 1988 and 1991. And so two of the former command economies begin to enter the global economic system as market economies. The GATT finally comes to an end with the Uruguay round of 1986 to 1994, which culminates in the formation of the World Trade Organization and the admission of China into the WTO in 2001. And this really creates the first truly global market economy. The earlier globalization involved a handful of European powers and a few settler societies around the world. But with the creation of the WTO and the entry of China and Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, into the global market economy, we truly have a global market economy where everyone is connected in some kind of market, with the possible exception of North Korea. And this, the revival of the global economy, as before, led to a revival and expansion of international migration, with new destination areas in Europe, East Asia, and throughout the Pacific, and new sending areas in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. And you can see here summary diagrams of the current international migration system that corresponds to the global economy that emerged post-1970 and really blossomed in the 1990s and in the early 20th century. Abel and Sander, in their science article, came up with this nice circle diagram to show the structure of international exchanges of population in the current global system. And so, like I said, we have a truly global migration system at this point, connected with a well-ordered global economy, with stable international flows of people. So the 21st century global economy is different from the earlier 19th and early 20th century global economy, in that we have the free movement of capital, goods, commodities, information, and services, but at the same time, restricted movement of labor. There are strict barriers to workers migrating, more permissive barriers to those with human capital that is demand on global markets, but still restricted, and growing undocumented migration, and even the return of slave labor and indentured servitude in parts of the globalized economy. And there's a shift of labor-intensive production to the developing world, which brings about deindustrialization in the developed world. And the growing scale of markets in an information-intensive economy shifts income distributions, with rising inequality within nations and declining inequality between nations. And so this is the context in which international migration is going to unfold in the 21st century. And I see four basic drivers of international migration as the 21st century proceeds. First, demography. I'm a demographer, so naturally I think demography is destiny, but also economics and the nature of the global economy. The new players in this are climate and climate change, and how that influences both demography and economy, and governability, the rule of law, the degree to which nations are governable under ordered rules of law will become increasingly important. So the first thing about demography is population size. And the bigger the country, of course, the more migrants it's going to produce, other things equal. China is rapidly becoming an aging society, and it doesn't have great demographic potential for migration in terms of its population growth and its labor force growth. It's going to experience labor shortages in the near future. However, a very low rate of migration from 1.4 billion people produces a lot of migrants in the world. So even though the rate of outmigration from China may not be great, the number of Chinese migrants will be significant, particularly with China's Belt and Road Initiative. There's more potential for outmigration from India, which is about to surpass China as the world's largest country, and has a very different kind of demographic configuration, as we shall see. And there's great potential of migration from parts of the Middle East, as well as from sub-Saharan Africa, where the individual countries may not be that big, but the South Sub-Saharan African continent is rapidly growing with a large population. So here you see the demography in the world today, with sub-Saharan Africa really leading the world, with a few places like Iran and Afghanistan and in the Middle East contributing as well. But the rapid growth in the population is concentrated really in sub-Saharan Africa and a few places in the Muslim world. And this leads to youth dependency ratios, with large numbers of young people compared to workforce, the size of the workforce in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East, and an old age dependency ratio very high in the global north, which is Europe, North America, and Australia, and New Zealand, and parts of East Asia. GDP per capita, the biggest gaps are between sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East and the developed world, as you can see here. In terms of youth unemployment, unemployed youth are a large fraction of unemployed young people between the ages of 15 and 24 is a formula for pressures for outmigration. Labor migration is very age dependent, and rates of labor migration begin to rise in the late teens, peak at 22 or 23, and then fall fairly rapidly, and over the age of 30 rates of outmigration are very low. So many parts of the third world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, parts of North Africa, parts of the Middle East, and even parts of South America are poised to contribute large numbers of young workers on the global labor markets. And of course, income inequality is also a driver of migration. When there's a lot of poverty amidst great wealth, it produces tends to produce economic pressures for outmigration to other places. Climate change is the new, emerging as an important new driver In some ways, it's always been a driver of migration over the course of human history and prehistory, but it was slow, and climate changed slowly and changed human migration patterns slowly. But now it's changing very fast. And you can see places that are vulnerable to climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and parts of Central and South America. And these are also the places with large populations, higher rates of fertility, greater levels of inequality, and lower incomes relative to the global north. And then extreme weather events become more likely as climate change proceeds. So you can see that South Asia, India, parts of Africa, and Central America and parts of the Caribbean have become very, very vulnerable to extreme weather events, which will tend to produce displaced people, which may or may not become international migrants. And finally, the rule of law. Overall rule of law, here's the rule of law index in 2020. And you can see that the rule of law is lower in the global south than in the global north. It's much better in Europe, not so great since Trump came into office in the United States. But that is another factor that's going to be increasingly important in the future years. And with the rule of law and with climate change comes violence. This is a map of homicide rates at the subnational level. And so you can see that high rates of homicide in Mexico and Central America, high rates of homicide in parts of South America, parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. So these are other drivers that are emerging in the 21st century. So what we see then is a world shaping up to have a characteristic set of sending regions: Africa, the Middle East, not the oil importing part, but the rest of it, Central Asia, South Asia, Central America, and some of the Pacific Islands. The receiving regions will be Western Europe, North America, Western Europe, the Persian Gulf, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of East Asia. It's uncertain what's going to happen in Eastern Europe, South America, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. And I've just gone through the various drivers to lead to these conclusions. So this is an actual map of population movements charted, measured by the UN population branch using its migratory system. And you can see that these migration flows are basically flows tied to the global market economy. They're mainly flows of workers and their families, and they have structure, and they have organizations, and they have patterns. And this is the stable migration system that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st century during the peak and the emergence and peak of the second wave of globalization. But we're moving towards a different kind of world characterized by more violence, more climate change, declining rule of law, and widening gaps within and between nations that create instabilities for civic violence. And this is a similar visualization of world refugee flows since the year 2000. And you can see the structure of refugee flows is completely different than the organized structure of labor market flows. So these are highly structured, ordered movements that countries can manage fairly well. And these new flows are instead less structured and more chaotic and more concentrated in certain places of origin as well as places of destination. And you can see that Europe, in this sense, is much more vulnerable to flows given the countries that lie to its south and its southeast compared to the United States and the countries that lie to its south. The countries to the south of the US, Latin America and the Caribbean as a region is at replacement level fertility. There are a few outlying countries, but many countries are already below replacement level fertility. And Mexico has made the transition from high to low to replacement level fertility in recent years. So you can see these changes on the Mexico-US border. And what you've got here are border flows. These are apprehensions along the Mexico-US border from 2000 to 2019. And you can see that back in 2000, the border traffic was dominated completely by Mexicans. Mexicans accounted for 99% of all apprehensions along the border. And other countries were hardly represented at all. And there were always, there have been for some time, Central Americans coming in. Central Americans coming in from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And we've had peaks in the past and a peak here. But what really changed is in 2018 was a new and very large sudden inflow of migrants from Central America. And these migrants were very different from the migrants that had arrived from Mexico in earlier years, whereas the flow out of Mexico was distinctly a labor flow coming to jobs in the United States. So it was a huge outflow in 2000 of young workers, mainly males, coming to the United States for jobs, is replaced by a much smaller but very different flow of migrants out of Central America who are not coming for jobs, but for refuge to escape conditions that were caused by the US intervention in the 1980s, which destroyed the economies in these Northern Triangle nations and introduced endemic violence into the region, which has really never abated and which has in fact been exacerbated by US immigration policies and deportation policies. And this just shows what's happened to the undocumented population in the United States. These are estimates done by the Pew Hispanic Trust of Pew Hispanic Center of population change in the undocumented population. So you can see Mexico was growing through the 1990s and early 2000s. And then right around the time of the Great Recession, it goes negative. And then it goes decidedly negative, and then continues to be negative. And Central America, which had always been there, or at least since the 1980s when the US intervened, suddenly became the visible part of the migration. And this fueled a narrative in the United States about a brand new invasion. But of course, it wasn't brand new, and it really wasn't an invasion. It was people escaping conditions that the United States itself had caused in the 1980s. And they'd just been obscured with the massive numbers of Mexicans entering, but now they're very visible along the border. And up until 2018 dominated, but even that's been changing recently. So here's a graph of the most recent data. This is by month from October 2017 up to May of this year. And here you can see that huge surge of migrants from, these are apprehensions, but they're correlated with the number of people trying to cross the border, huge surge from Central America, causing what was perceived to be a new border crisis during the Trump administration. And in many ways, it wasn't really a crisis at the border, an immigration crisis. It was more a humanitarian crisis of people coming to seek asylum under US law, but not being allowed to go to a port of entry on the border, a border crossing, and try to claim asylum. They were thrown back into Mexico, where they languish in camps and then get desperate, and then they cross into the United States without authorization, and then they file for asylum, and that's called defensive asylum if you're deportable. But if you cross into the nation through a border crossing, that's called affirmative asylum. So, and that's allowable under US law, but we're not obeying our own laws. And this is creating this huge scene along the border where people that are desperate to leave conditions that are tied to the US intervention are not being allowed to come in and claim asylum. Now, we know how to do this. We did this from 1978 to 1998. We took in 1.3 million Indo-Chinese refugees and processed them and gave them legal residence. And now the second and third generations are actually doing quite well. We can do the same with Central Americans, but for political reasons, we've chosen not to. So the late 20th century witnessed the apogee of neoliberalism with market economics, democratic states, the so-called end of history, a statement of pure hubris if there ever was one. But globalization is really not the norm in human history. And the first wave of globalization ended very badly with 2 world wars and 125 million deaths. And the second wave of globalization is beginning to look precarious with populist backlashes in Brazil, the United States, Mexico, Poland, Hungary, Britain, and uncontrolled outbursts of violence, state violence in Syria, Myanmar, and Venezuela, non-state violence by actors such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and populist militias, including the insurrection that took over the Capitol building in the United States in January. And of course, criminal violence, the rise of cartels and organized crime, working not only through physical crime, but increasingly through cyber crime, and the weakening of multilateral institutions, accompanied by political polarization within countries and authoritarian regimes emerging within the EU, particularly Poland and Hungary. And all these processes are complicated by climate change. Now, the theories and data that we use as migration scholars basically assume the status quo of the late 20th century of expanding markets within a stable global system. The theories, neoclassical economics, the new economics of labor migration, segmented labor market theory, networks and social capital theory, world systems theory, these all basically posit a global economy, a global capitalist market economy, but they don't really deal with the new forces that are going to be affecting migration patterns in the future. The future portends migration outside this very stable system that we observed in the late 20th century and early 21st century, with more moves driven by climate change, more moves driven by rising violence, and an increasing predominance of forced migrants rather than labor migrants in the global system. So the implications that I take from this brief review of what's going on in the world and what's going on at the Mexico-US border today is that we need to think about forced migration and incorporate forced migration into theoretical models and move beyond a narrow consideration of refugees and asylees as some kind of separate category. They are international migrants and they're going to be coming outside of normal channels in the future. So we need to abandon the separate treatment of forced migration as something different from international migration and incorporation and make a fuller incorporation of state actions into our theoretical models if we're going to understand how interventions by the states affect flows of migrants. And we need to merge the collection of data on forced and labor migrants into a single system that's coherent. So that is my very quick summary of where we are in the world today, how we got there, and what that means for we who study migration and collect data on migration and develop theories of migration.